Hello and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm glad you've joined me tonight, ready to slow down, breathe deeply, and let your thoughts drift back through the quiet corridors of time. This is your moment to leave the noise of the day behind, to step away from screens and deadlines and the relentless rush of now, and step gently onto the torchlit streets of ancient Athens, where philosophy was born not in marble temples or grand lecture halls, but in crowded symposia, in wine-soaked conversations that lasted until dawn, in moments of laughter and argument and profound human connection that changed the world forever. Here, in this space between past and present, we wander together through vanished worlds that time tried to erase but couldn't quite forget. We walk the narrow streets where Socrates once questioned everyone he met, where Plato gathered his students in olive groves, where ordinary citizens became philosophers over cups of wine diluted with water and honey. We stand in doorways where lamplight spilled onto cobblestones, where voices rose in debate and song, where ideas about truth and justice and the good life were hammered out not in silence and solemnity, but in the warm chaos of friendship and festivity. Each episode here isn't just about dates and famous names. It's not about memorizing which philosopher said what or the rise and fall of empires catalogued in textbooks. It's about the lives lived, the symposiarch pouring wine with practiced hands, the flute girl playing melodies now lost to time, the young student hearing an idea that would change everything he believed, the moment when wine and wisdom mixed and something extraordinary happened. It's about the beauty they created, the questions they asked, the conversations that still echo across 25 centuries, waiting patiently for us to listen, to wonder, to remember. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through time, a like and subscribe help keep this channel alive, help us continue exploring together. But for now, you don't need to do anything but listen. The sun is setting over Athens in the year 416 before the Common Era, and the city is preparing for evening in ways that would seem both familiar and utterly strange to modern eyes. The heat of the day is finally breaking. That oppressive Mediterranean warmth that makes marble buildings radiate like ovens and turns narrow streets into corridors of stifling air. Now, as shadows lengthen across the agora, the city exhales, and a different Athens begins to emerge from the daylight world of commerce and politics and public life. This is the Athens we rarely see in history books, the one that existed after the assembly disbanded and the law courts closed, and the shops in the marketplace shuttered their wooden doors. This is the Athens of lamplight and wine cups, of reclining couches and philosophical debate, of music and poetry, and conversations that stretched through the night until the first grey light of dawn crept over Mount Hymettus. This is the Athens where some of the most important ideas in Western civilization were born, not in temples or government buildings, but in private homes, in gardens, in moments of relaxed intimacy that the Greeks called symposia. The symposium was not what we mean today when we use that word. It wasn't a formal academic conference or a lecture hall full of note-taking students. The Greek symposium was a drinking party, but calling it that doesn't capture the profound cultural importance of these gatherings. It was part social club, part intellectual salon, part religious ritual, part entertainment, and entirely central to how educated Athenian men understood themselves and their world. These gatherings happened almost every night in hundreds of homes across Athens, in the house of a wealthy merchant near the Nix Hill, in the modest dwelling of a potter in the Kerameikos district, in the spacious andron of a prominent politician's villa. Men gathered after their evening meal to drink, to talk, to argue, to laugh, to test ideas against each other in the crucible of friendship and wine. The physical space of a symposium was carefully designed. The andron, the men's quarters, featured couches arranged around the walls, usually accommodating between 7 and 15 guests. These weren't chairs, they were clinai, dining couches where men reclined on their left sides, propped on cushions, leaving their right hands free for eating, drinking, and gesturing during conversation. The floor between the couches was open space where servants moved, where entertainers performed, where the conversation itself seemed to circulate like wine poured from a crater. The walls were painted with scenes of past symposia, of mythological feasts, of Dionysus and his revels. Oil lamps hung from bronze stands, casting warm, flickering light that made shadows dance across frescoed plaster. The air smelled of olive oil, of wine, of perfumed unguents that guests rubbed on their hair and beards, of incense burning in small bronze burners, of sweat and wool and the indefinable scent of many human bodies in an enclosed space on a warm Mediterranean night. This was the world that produced Socrates and Plato, Aristotle and Epicurus. This was the crucible where Western philosophy was forged, not in the cold light of abstract reason, but in the warm glow of friendship, wine, and endless conversation. To understand ancient philosophy, you must first understand the Symposium. You must feel the weight of the wine cup in your hand, hear the laughter and argument, smell the lamp oil, and see the shadows flickering on painted walls. Athens after dark was not a city that slept. It was a city that thought, that talked, that questioned everything it believed and then questioned the questions themselves. And it all happened here, in these rooms, in these moments, with wine and friendship as the catalysts for ideas that would echo through millennia. For centuries we knew about Greek symposia only through texts, through the words of Plato and Xenophon and Plutarch describing these gatherings in prose that was itself shaped by symposium culture. The Symposium of Plato, that masterpiece of philosophical literature, gave us Socrates debating the nature of love with poets and generals and playwrights, all of them reclining on couches, all of them drinking wine mixed with water in various ratios, all of them taking turns speaking as the night wore on. But texts can lie. Texts can idealize. Texts can present a sanitized version of reality that smooths away the messy human details that make the past feel real. For the longest time, symposia existed in our imagination as impossibly refined gatherings, as philosophical seminars where brilliant men discussed abstract ideas in perfect sobriety and decorum. The wine seemed decorative, the social aspects merely background noise to the real business of intellectual discourse. Then archaeologists began digging in Athens and throughout the Greek world, and the reality of symposia came flooding back in fragments of painted pottery, in architectural remains, in the physical evidence of how these gatherings actually functioned. The discovery wasn't dramatic, like finding a lost city or unearthing a royal tomb. It was gradual, accumulating piece by piece over decades of excavation. But its impact on our understanding of Greek culture was profound. The pottery came first. Thousands upon thousands of drinking vessels emerged from ancient trash heaps, from wells where broken ceramics were dumped, from graves where cups and craters were buried with the dead. These weren't generic containers, they were symposium ware, vessels specifically designed for the rituals of the drinking party, and they were covered with images that showed exactly how symposia actually looked. The kylix, the shallow drinking cup with two handles, appeared everywhere in excavations. When you held one, when you turned it in your hands, you could see how it was meant to be used, how the handles allowed you to drink while reclining on your left side, how the shallow bowl meant you sipped rather than gulped. And painted on these cups, inside and out, were scenes of symposia in progress. The images were revelatory. They showed men reclining on couches, yes, but they also showed them vomiting from too much wine, engaging in sexual activities with the serving boys and entertainment girls, playing games of kotobos where they flicked wine dregs at targets, singing with their heads thrown back in drunken abandon. These weren't refined philosophical seminars. These were parties, real parties with all the excess and indulgence and loss of control that parties entail. One cup, discovered in an ancient well in the Athenian agora, showed a bearded symposiast leaning over the edge of his couch to vomit while his companions laughed and a naked flute girl continued playing her oulos. Another showed two men locked in an intense conversation, their faces close together, one hand gesturing emphatically while the other gripped a wine cup. A third depicted a young man balancing a cup on his erect phallus, while others cheered him on, a party trick that required considerable inebriation to attempt. The architectural evidence added more layers. Excavations of wealthy Athenian homes revealed andrones with their couches still positioned around the walls, with drains in the floors for washing away spilled wine and other fluids, with walls painted in rich reds and blacks, with niches for oil lamps and shelves for storing cups and craters. These were purpose-built spaces for drinking and conversation, rooms designed to facilitate the kind of gathering that Greek men considered essential to civilized life. Written graffiti appeared on excavated walls. Callias is beautiful, scratched into plaster. The Symposium of the 30, naming a political club. Xenophon poured badly, a complaint about a symposiarch who mixed the wine wrong. These weren't literary texts composed for posterity. These were spontaneous scratches, the ancient equivalent of bathroom graffiti, preserving the casual, unguarded voice of symposium culture in ways that formal literature never could. The discovery that changed everything was gradual, accumulating over generations of archaeological work, but its message was clear. Greek philosophy didn't emerge from marble halls and solemn contemplation. It emerged from drinking parties, from the loosened tongues and freed inhibitions that wine provided, from the particular social space where men felt safe to question everything, to challenge each other, to say things they would never say in public, in daylight, in the sober world of politics and commerce. Socrates debated while drunk. Plato wrote dialogues set at symposia, because that's where the real conversations happened. The birth of Western philosophy was inseparable from the culture of the drinking party, and understanding one required understanding the other. When scholars first confronted the archaeological evidence of what symposia really looked like, the response was complicated, coloured by centuries of reverence for ancient Greece as the cradle of Western civilization and rational thought. The idea that Socrates and Plato had done their most important thinking while drinking wine at parties, surrounded by entertainment girls and drunken companions, was difficult for many to accept. The 19th century Victorian scholars who dominated classical studies had constructed an image of ancient Greece that reflected their own values, a Greece of marble white statues and rational discourse, of democracy and philosophy emerging from purely intellectual sources. They had cleaned the wine stains from symposia, had ignored the sexual elements, had turned Plato's Symposium into a treatise on abstract love rather than what it clearly was, a detailed description of an actual drinking party, where men got progressively drunker while debating whether to sleep with each other. The painted pottery created cognitive dissonance. Here were images of respected philosophers in various states of inebriation and sexual activity. Here were the physical tools of wine consumption, craters that held gallons of wine mixed with water, cups designed for rapid drinking, game pieces for drinking games. Here was evidence that the refined intellectual culture they admired had emerged from a social context that looked more like a fraternity party than a philosophy seminar. Some scholars simply dismissed the evidence. The pottery paintings, they argued, were exaggerations, comic representations that didn't reflect real practice. The vomiting scenes were jokes. The sexual imagery was fantasy. Real symposia, the symposia where actual philosophy happened, must have been more restrained, more sober, more in keeping with the dignity of the ideas being discussed. Others tried to separate the philosophical symposia from the common ones. Perhaps they suggested there were different types of drinking parties. The ones where Socrates went were serious intellectual gatherings, where wine was consumed in moderation and conversation remained elevated. The ones depicted on pottery were lower-class affairs, the kind of vulgar entertainment that proper philosophers would have avoided. But the evidence wouldn't cooperate with these comfortable interpretations. Plato himself described Socrates drinking everyone under the table at Agathon's Symposium, remaining completely sober while his companions passed out around him. Xenophon's Symposium featured a dwarf entertainer and an acrobatic sex show performed by a young couple. These weren't different kinds of symposia. Entertainment, wine, sexual elements, and philosophical discourse all coexisted in the same social space. A younger generation of scholars, influenced by anthropology and less invested in maintaining the pristine image of ancient Greece, began to accept and even embrace the evidence. They pointed out that many cultures throughout history had used alcohol as a tool for facilitating certain kinds of conversation and social bonding. They noted that the Greek symposium had rules, structures, rituals that channeled the potentially chaotic effects of wine into culturally productive directions. The symposiarch, the master of ceremonies for each gathering, controlled how much wine was mixed with water, when cups were refilled, what order speakers would address the group. This wasn't uncontrolled drunkenness, it was managed inebriation, carefully calibrated to create the right atmosphere for the kind of frank, uninhibited conversation that Greek men valued. Wine, these scholars argued, wasn't incidental to Greek philosophy, it was essential. It loosened social constraints, allowed men to question hierarchies and challenge authorities in ways that would have been dangerous in public contexts. It created a space where a stonecutter like Socrates could argue with generals and politicians as equals, where radical ideas could be proposed and debated without fear of prosecution. The debate itself revealed how deeply invested modern culture was in certain ideas about how knowledge and wisdom should be produced. We wanted philosophy to emerge from sober contemplation, from individual genius working in isolation, from pure reason untainted by bodily pleasures or social contexts. The archaeological evidence insisted otherwise. It showed that the most important ideas in Western thought emerged from a specific social practice, one that involved bodies, pleasure, friendship, wine, and the particular kind of conversation that happened when inhibitions lowered and men felt free to question everything. The wonder came gradually. As scholars accepted the evidence, they began to see the symposium not as an embarrassing context that needed to be explained away, but as a remarkable cultural invention. The Greeks had created a social technology for producing certain kinds of thought, a structured environment where wine and friendship and competitive conversation combined to push ideas in new directions. Skepticism remained, of course. Some still argued that the real philosophy happened elsewhere, that Plato and Aristotle did their serious work in the morning, sober, and merely used symposium imagery as a literary device. But the weight of evidence was overwhelming. Greek philosophy was symposium philosophy, born in wine and conversation, inseparable from the social and bodily context that made it possible. The contradiction at the heart of the symposium was profound and deeply Greek in its complexity. On one hand, Greek culture placed enormous emphasis on sophrosyn, on moderation and self-control, on the rational mind governing the unruly appetites of the body. On the other hand, the symposium, the central social institution of educated Greek male culture, was built around the deliberate consumption of a substance that undermined self-control and rational thought. This wasn't a contradiction the Greeks were unaware of. They thought about it constantly, debated it endlessly, made it a central theme in their art and literature. Wine was called pharmakon, a word that meant both medicine and poison, depending on how it was used. In proper measure, mixed with water in the right proportions, consumed in the structured environment of the symposium, wine was the gift of Dionysus, a tool for creating the kind of social and intellectual communion that Greeks valued above almost everything else. Consumed improperly, unmixed, in excess, outside the ritual context, wine turned men into beasts, destroyed families, ruined cities. The legend of the symposium, the ideal that Greeks told themselves about these gatherings, was that they were places where wine facilitated conversation and philosophy, while never overwhelming rationality. The symposiarch mixed the wine at a ratio of 2 or 3 parts water to 1 part wine, ensuring that participants achieved a pleasant relaxation without losing control. Conversation followed strict rules, with each guest taking turns speaking, with topics chosen collectively, with moderation and courtesy governing all interactions. This idealized symposium appeared in texts written by and for the elite, in philosophical dialogues and high-minded literature that presented these gatherings as refined intellectual salons. Plato's Symposium was the ultimate expression of this ideal, a drinking party where philosophy triumphed over wine, where Socrates remained completely sober despite consuming more alcohol than anyone else, where love was discussed in increasingly abstract and elevated terms until it became love of the eternal forms themselves, pure philosophy undiluted by bodily desire. The reality, visible in pottery paintings and casual references in comedy and less elevated literature, was messier. Real symposia featured competition as much as cooperation, excess as much as moderation, sexual activity as much as philosophical discourse. Men got drunk, sometimes very drunk. They vomited, they passed out, they made poor decisions, started fights, engaged in sexual activities they might regret in the morning. The pottery paintings showed this reality without shame or judgment. They depicted men in various states of undress and inebriation, engaging in activities that range from affectionate to explicitly sexual. They showed servants, often enslaved people, attending to the needs of symposiasts. They showed musicians and dancers, almost always women or boys, providing entertainment that was visual and sexual as much as it was musical. These weren't secret vices hidden from public view. They were standard features of symposium culture, acknowledged by everyone even if the philosophical texts downplayed them. Aristophanes' comedies referenced them constantly. Legal speeches mentioned symposia as places where violence and crimes often occurred. Medical writers warned about the health effects of excessive drinking. Everyone knew that symposia were places where social norms relaxed and things happened that wouldn't happen in daylight. The contradiction ran deeper than just the gap between ideal and practice. It touched the fundamental question of what philosophy was and how it worked. If reason was the highest human faculty, if philosophy was about transcending bodily desires and achieving pure rational knowledge, then why did the Greeks conduct philosophy in a context specifically designed to undermine rational control? Why did Plato, the philosopher most associated with elevating reason over appetite, set his dialogues at drinking parties? Some modern scholars have argued that the Greeks didn't actually see this as a contradiction. They understood wine as a tool, something that could reveal truths that sober rationality might miss. Wine loosened tongues, broke down social pretenses, made people say what they really thought rather than what social conventions demanded. In the right context with the right people, this could lead to more authentic philosophy, not less. Others suggest that the symposium was about managing the tension between reason and passion, about finding a middle way where both could coexist productively. The structure and rules of the symposium channeled the chaotic effects of wine into socially useful directions. You got drunk, but in a controlled way. You spoke freely, but took turns. You questioned everything, but remained friends. The legend said symposia were places of pure intellectual discourse. The reality was that they were places where mind and body, reason and passion, self-control and abandon all mixed together in ways that produced something neither could achieve alone. Greek philosophy emerged from this contradiction, from the productive tension between what Greeks said they valued and what they actually did, between the ideal of rational moderation and the reality of wine-soaked conversation that lasted until dawn. The pottery paintings preserved this reality, showing us a Greece that was more complicated, more human, more interesting than the marble-white legend we inherited. They showed us that wisdom and drunkenness, philosophy and pleasure, high culture and low behaviour all occupied the same space, the same moment, the same cup of wine passed between friends in lamplight. Modern scholars looking back at the symposium have developed competing theories about what this institution actually meant for Greek culture, and how we should understand its role in the development of philosophy. These aren't merely academic debates. They touch fundamental questions about the nature of knowledge, the relationship between mind and body, and how social contexts shape human thought. The rationalist interpretation, dominant for much of the 20th century, tried to minimize the importance of wine and bodily pleasure in symposium culture. These scholars argued that the symposium was essentially a men's club, a social space where the elite gathered to network and discuss politics and philosophy. The wine was incidental, the entertainment was background noise, and the real action was intellectual. Greek philosophy succeeded in this view, despite the symposium context, not because of it. This interpretation struggled to explain why the Greeks themselves placed such emphasis on wine, why Dionysus was considered essential to symposium culture, why the god of wine and madness was invoked at the beginning of every drinking party. It also couldn't account for the centrality of symposium imagery in philosophical texts. Plato didn't just set one dialogue at a symposium, he set many there, and he made the specific practices and rituals of the drinking party integral to how the philosophical arguments unfolded. The structuralist interpretation, influenced by anthropology, focused on the symposium as a ritual space with its own rules and logic. These scholars pointed out that symposia had consistent structures across the Greek world. They began with libations and hymns to Dionysus. The symposiarch was chosen or appointed. Wine was mixed in specific ratios. Conversation followed patterns, with topics proposed and explored collectively. There were games, competitions in poetry and riddle-solving, drinking contests. This structure, structuralists argued, was what made symposia productive. It wasn't chaos or simple drunkenness. It was carefully managed transformation, taking participants from their everyday identities and social positions into a liminal space where different rules applied. In this space, a stonecutter could challenge a general, radical ideas could be proposed without consequences, the unspoken assumptions of Greek society could be questioned. The embodied cognition interpretation, emerging from more recent work in philosophy of mind and cognitive science, suggests that Greek philosophy's symposium origins actually explains many of its distinctive features. These scholars argue that thinking isn't just something that happens in isolated brains, it's something that emerges from social interaction, from physical contexts, from the specific ways bodies and environments and conversations come together. From this perspective, wine wasn't incidental to Greek philosophy, it was constitutive. The slight disinhibition that proper wine consumption provided allowed different kinds of questions to be asked, different connections to be made. The physical proximity of bodies reclining on couches, the warmth of lamplight, the shared experience of eating and drinking together, all created conditions where certain kinds of insight became possible. These scholars point to modern research showing that mild intoxication can enhance creativity and associative thinking, can help people make connections they wouldn't make in a completely sober state. They note that many cultures have used psychoactive substances as tools for facilitating insight and revelation. The Greeks, in this view, had discovered an effective social technology for producing philosophical thought, and it involved wine. The feminist interpretation raises different questions. Nearly all symposium participants were men. Women appeared as servants, musicians, sex workers, never as full participants in the philosophical conversations. What does it mean that Western philosophy emerged from an explicitly male homosocial context? How did the exclusion of women shape what kinds of questions were asked? What kinds of answers seemed reasonable? These scholars note that Greek philosophy obsessed over certain topics, the nature of justice and courage and wisdom, while largely ignoring others, questions about care and relationships and domestic life. They suggest this wasn't accidental. It reflected the symposium context, where men gathered away from their families, where they performed a certain kind of masculinity that involved competition and debate, and proving yourself intellectually. The revisionist interpretation, taking seriously the sexual elements of symposium culture, argues that we can't understand Greek philosophy without understanding Greek sexuality. The eroticism of the symposium wasn't peripheral, it was central. Many symposia included sexual activity between male citizens and younger males, or with enslaved persons. The language of philosophy was saturated with erotic imagery. Plato's Symposium made the connection explicit, presenting philosophy itself as a form of eros, of desire for beauty and truth. This interpretation makes many people uncomfortable. It suggests that the origins of Western philosophy are inseparable from practices we now condemn, from power imbalances and age-inappropriate relationships, and the exploitation of enslaved people. But ignoring this context, these scholars argue, means we miss something essential about how Greek thought worked, how desire and knowledge and power all tangled together in the symposium space. The pragmatic interpretation suggests we should accept that symposia were complex social phenomena that served multiple purposes simultaneously. They were networking opportunities and intellectual salons and drinking parties and sexual venues and religious rituals all at once. Trying to reduce them to any single function misses the point. Greeks valued symposia precisely because they combined all these elements, because they created a space where public and private, sacred and profane, reason and passion could mix in productive ways. The debate continues, each interpretation revealing as much about modern assumptions as about ancient realities. What's clear is that the symposium was more important to Greek culture than we long realized, and that Western philosophy's origins are stranger, messier, and more interesting than the sanitized versions we inherited. Understanding what actually happened in ancient Athenian symposia requires detective work, piecing together evidence from multiple sources that each provide only partial views. No single ancient text describes symposium practices comprehensively. No pottery painting shows everything. We must combine archaeological remains with literary descriptions with casual references in unrelated documents to build a composite picture of how these gatherings functioned. The archaeological investigation starts with the physical spaces. Excavations in the Athenian agora, in private houses on the slopes of the Acropolis, in wealthy villas outside the city walls, have revealed dozens of andronies, the special rooms designed for symposia. These rooms follow consistent patterns. They're usually square or nearly square, sized to accommodate between 7 and 15 couches arranged around the walls. The floor is often decorated with elaborate mosaics, geometric patterns or figured scenes. The walls were painted, usually in red or black, sometimes with figured scenes of past symposia or mythological feasts. Archaeologists measured the couch spaces carefully. A standard klein was about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, sized for 1 or sometimes 2 reclining men. The couches were positioned with precision, leaving space for servants to move between them, for entertainers to perform in the centre, for the conversation itself to circulate. The sight lines mattered. Every couch had a view of the centre space and of the other participants. This wasn't accidental. The room was designed to facilitate group conversation, to make everyone visible to everyone else. The pottery investigation provides the richest evidence. Tens of thousands of symposium vessels have been recovered from excavations across the Greek world. These weren't random cups and bowls. They were specialized equipment, each type designed for specific functions within the drinking ritual. The crater, a large mixing bowl where wine was diluted with water, stood in the center of the room. Symposium craters were massive, some holding 10 or 15 gallons of mixed wine, enough for an entire night of drinking. The pottery paintings on these vessels show the symposium in action. On one kylix from around 480 BCE, you can see the complete sequence. The exterior shows servants carrying wine jars and mixing bowls preparing for the evening. Inside the cup, visible only when you drained it, a single symposiast reclines, cup in hand, mid-speech. His mouth is open, his hand gestures, frozen in the moment of making some argument or telling some story. Literary investigation adds another layer. Plato's Symposium provides the most detailed description of how these gatherings proceeded. After the meal, slaves cleared the tables and brought water for washing hands. Someone proposed a toast and the symposiarch was chosen, in this case Eryximachus the doctor, who would control the wine mixing for the evening. He proposed they drink moderately, that they dismiss the flute girl, and that they spend the evening in conversation, each taking a turn speaking on the theme of love. This matches the pattern described in other sources. Xenophon's Symposium shows a similar structure. Plutarch's Table Talk, though written much later, describes symposium customs in detail. The consistency across sources suggests these were real practices, not literary inventions. Symposia had rules, structures, rituals that everyone understood and followed, at least in principle. The investigation reveals how wine was consumed. The Greeks never drank wine unmixed, or at least they claimed not to. Unmixed wine was barbaric. The way Persians drank, the kind of behaviour that led to madness and violence. Proper Greek wine was always mixed with water, usually at ratios ranging from 1:1 to 1:3, wine to water. The symposiarch decided the ratio based on how the evening should proceed. Stronger mixes for evenings meant to be more intense, weaker mixes for longer conversations that required clearer heads. But the investigation also reveals the gap between prescription and practice. Comedy and legal speeches reference symposia where men drank heavily, where the wine was mixed stronger as the night went on, where competitions emerged to see who could drink the most. Pottery paintings show men vomiting, passed out, being carried home by servants. The ideal of moderate drinking was just that, an ideal that reality often departed from. The musical investigation adds crucial context. Nearly every source mentions music at symposia. The aulos, a double reed instrument similar to an oboe, was standard. Lyres and other string instruments appeared. Singers performed traditional songs and newly composed pieces. The music wasn't background, it was integral to the experience, setting rhythms for the conversation, providing entertainment between philosophical speeches, creating the atmosphere that made the evening work. Some of the most revealing evidence comes from graffiti and casual inscriptions, scratched on walls, carved into tables, written on scraps of pottery. These spontaneous texts preserve the unguarded voice of symposium culture. Drinking songs appear, some well known throughout Greece, others apparently composed on the spot. Lists of symposium members, recording who attended particular gatherings. Boasts and complaints and jokes, the kind of things men wrote when drunk and among friends. The investigation continues. New excavations yield new evidence. Better understanding of pottery production reveals regional variations in symposium customs. Closer reading of literary texts shows layers of meaning that earlier generations missed. What emerges is a picture of symposium culture as both more structured and more chaotic than anyone imagined, a sophisticated social institution that channeled the potentially destructive effects of wine and male bonding into culturally productive directions, but never entirely successfully, never without excess and violence and the messiness that comes with being human. The evidence that brings symposia back to life comes in fragments, literal and figurative. In museum collections around the world, Thousands of broken pottery pieces preserve moments from symposium culture, and reading these fragments requires imagination as much as scholarship. Each painted scene is a window into a vanished world, but the view is partial, frozen in a single instant, requiring us to reconstruct the before and after from context and comparison. One fragment in the Athens National Museum shows a bearded man mid-speech, his mouth open, one finger raised in the gesture that Greeks used for making an important point. His expression is intense, engaged, the kind of face someone makes when arguing something they believe deeply. Next to him, partially preserved, another figure leans forward, listening or perhaps preparing to respond. The composition suggests debate, the back and forth of symposium conversation captured in painted clay. Another piece, this one in Berlin, preserves a complete symposium scene despite being assembled from dozens of fragments. 7 men recline on couches arranged around an invisible centre. Each holds a kylix, the shallow drinking cup. Between them, servants move, one pouring wine from an ornoccio into cups, another carrying what appears to be a platter of food. In the centre, barely visible, a naked figure plays an aulos, the double pipe that provided music for the evening. What makes this fragment evidence rather than just decoration is the specificity of detail. The painter knew symposia intimately. You can see it in how the men recline, propped on their left elbows, bodies angled to face the centre while remaining comfortable. You can see it in the ratios of the wine cups, all different sizes suggesting different levels of consumption. You can see it in the servant's posture, the practiced ease of someone who pours wine professionally, who knows how to move through crowded spaces without disturbing the guests. The literary fragments add different kinds of evidence. Scattered through Greek literature are references to specific historical symposia, gatherings where important events occurred. Alcibiades burst into Agathon's symposium drunk and crowned with ivy and violets, interrupting Socrates' speech to deliver his own drunken encomium. The symposium where Critias and Alcibiades allegedly plotted the oligarchic coup of 411. The gathering where a young Aristotle first met Plato, beginning a relationship that would define both their lives. These references are often brief, mentioned in passing as context for something else, but they confirm that symposia were where things happened in Athens, where relationships formed, where political alliances were made and broken, where young men found mentors and lovers, where reputations were built and destroyed. The symposium wasn't separate from public life. It was where public life was negotiated privately, where the real decisions got made before being performed in the assembly or law courts. The archaeological fragments include objects beyond pottery, bronze wine strainers with elaborate decorative patterns, stone pestles for crushing herbs and spices to flavour wine, bone and ivory game pieces for kotobos and other drinking games, silver cups with inscriptions, dedications, owners' names. Each object is a fragment of the total symposium experience, material evidence of practices that texts only describe. One particularly revealing find from a well in the Athenian agora included dozens of broken kylix, along with the bones of a dog and the remains of garlands made from myrtle and ivy. Someone had dumped the aftermath of a symposium into the well, and the combination of elements tells a story. The broken cups suggest enthusiasm, possibly violence. The dog bones indicate that dogs sometimes attended symposia, mentioned in several sources as companions who lay beneath the couches waiting for scraps. The garlands were worn by symposiasts, marks of participation in the Dionysian ritual. Musical fragments survive as well. Greek musical notation, though rare, appears on several documents describing drinking songs and symposium performances. We can't hear how these sounded, can't reconstruct the exact melodies, but we have the words and the rhythm, can imagine how they were performed, how symposiasts sang together between rounds of conversation. Some of the most powerful evidence comes from the symposium's influence on Greek literature. The sympotic genres, poetry and songs specifically composed for symposium performance, developed distinctive formal features, short, punchy lines suitable for recitation between drinks. Competitive structures where one poem answered another, references to shared experiences, inside jokes that only symposium participants would understand. These formal features reveal how the symposium context shaped what could be said and how. Even philosophical arguments bear traces of their symposium origins. The dialogue form that Plato perfected, with multiple speakers taking turns, with arguments building on each other, with dramatic setting and character development as important as logical structure, all of this reflects symposium practice. Philosophy as written conversation, as performance, as something that happens between people rather than inside a single mind, this was the symposium's gift to Western thought. The fragments are endless, scattered across museums and archaeological sites and ancient texts. Each one a small piece of the larger puzzle, a graffito scratched into a wall, a curse tablet mentioning a symposium, a legal speech describing a drunken assault, a medical text warning about symposium health risks, a comedy making fun of symposium pretensions. Together they create a composite picture detailed enough to feel real, fragmented enough to remain mysterious. We can walk into an ancient andron now, at least in imagination. We can see the lamplight flickering on painted walls, smell the wine and olive oil and incense, hear the orlos playing and voices rising in argument and laughter. We can feel the weight of a kylix in our hands, taste the honeyed wine, sense the particular intimacy of reclining next to someone in the warm darkness, talking about ideas that matter. The evidence brings the symposium back to life. Not completely, never completely, but enough. Enough to understand that Greek philosophy was born here, in these rooms, in these moments, among these people, in this particular combination of wine and friendship and conversation that the Greeks valued above almost everything else. Beneath the surface of symposium culture lay something Greek men rarely discussed openly, something that texts mostly avoided and pottery paintings only hinted at, something that becomes visible only when you look carefully at the accumulated evidence and ask uncomfortable questions. The symposium wasn't just a space for wine and philosophy. It was a space where Greek male sexuality was expressed, enacted, and negotiated in ways that structured relationships throughout Athenian society. The evidence appears everywhere once you know to look for it. In Plato's Symposium, the philosophical dialogue ostensibly about love, the actual topic is explicitly pederastic relationships, the culturally sanctioned romantic and sexual bonds between adult men and adolescent boys. Every speaker addresses this theme. Pausanias distinguishes between noble and common love, arguing that love between an older man and a youth is the highest form when properly conducted. Alcibiades describes his failed attempt to seduce Socrates, offering his beauty in exchange for wisdom. This wasn't metaphorical. The symposium was where these relationships began, where adult men met and courted the sons of other citizens, where younger men were integrated into elite male culture through bonds that were simultaneously pedagogical, romantic, and sexual. The institution that produced Western philosophy was also the institution that structured intergenerational male desire in ancient Athens. The pottery paintings show this clearly. Courtship scenes appear on hundreds of sympotic vessels. An older bearded man offers gifts to a youth, a hare or a rooster or a money purse. The youth stands modestly, eyes downcast, considering. The older man gestures, speaks, argues his case. Sometimes other figures watch, commenting or approving. These are formalized scenes following cultural scripts everyone understood. Other paintings are more explicit. Men embracing youths, hands wandering, sexual acts depicted with varying degrees of directness. These images appeared on vessels used at symposia, were part of the visual culture of the drinking party. Looking at them while drinking from them was part of the experience, reinforcement of the norms and practices that symposia existed to transmit. The deeper mystery is why ancient sources discuss this so obliquely. We have extensive philosophical treatises on the nature of love and desire. We have countless pottery images. We have legal speeches that reference these relationships. But we don't have the direct discussion you might expect of something so central to the culture. The practices are everywhere in the evidence but rarely explicitly acknowledged in formal discourse. Part of the answer is that these relationships were simultaneously central and controversial. Greeks themselves debated whether such relationships were appropriate, what forms they should take, what distinguished noble from shameful desire. Pausanias' speech in Plato's Symposium outlines elaborate rules. The older man should desire the youth's character and mind, not just his body. The youth should grant favours for the sake of education and virtue, not for money or status. The relationship should be reciprocal exchange, not exploitation. But the gap between ideal and practice was enormous. Legal speeches mention lawsuits over disputed relationships. Comedy mocks older men obsessed with beautiful youths. Medical texts discuss health problems arising from certain sexual practices. The Symposium was where these contradictions played out, where men navigated between cultural ideals and personal desires, where young men learned to manage the attention of older males who controlled access to political and economic power. For modern audiences, this is perhaps the most difficult aspect of Greek culture to confront. The institution that gave us Socrates and Plato, that birthed Western philosophy, was also an institution structured around relationships we now classify as abusive, relationships involving adolescents unable to fully consent, relationships embedded in profound power, imbalances of age, status, and social position. Some scholars argue we shouldn't judge ancient cultures by modern standards, that Greek pederasty was culturally different from modern abuse, that the relationships involved genuine affection and educational purpose. Others insist that power imbalances and age disparities create inherent problems regardless of cultural context, that we can acknowledge Greek philosophical achievements while also recognizing the troubling practices that produced them. What's undeniable is that Greek philosophy emerged from this context, that the dialogues we still read were set at gatherings where such relationships were negotiated, that the idea of philosophy itself as the pursuit of wisdom through desire, through eros, was shaped by the particular forms of desire that symposia sanctioned and structured. The mystery deepens when you consider how thoroughly this context has been erased from most presentations of Greek philosophy. Generations of students read Plato's Symposium without understanding what the text is actually describing, without recognizing that the love being discussed is specifically pederastic love, without seeing how the entire dialogue is structured around symposium practices including the sexual elements. This erasure serves purposes. It allows us to claim Greek philosophy as the foundation of Western civilization, without confronting uncomfortable aspects of that foundation. It lets us extract the ideas while ignoring the social practices that produced them. It maintains the fiction that philosophy emerged from pure rational contemplation, rather than from specific historically situated practices that we might find objectionable. But the evidence won't be erased. The pottery survives, the texts survive, the architectural remains survive. They tell a story more complicated than the sanitized version, a story about how intellectual achievement and problematic social practices coexisted in the same institution, the same space, the same moments of wine-soaked conversation in lamplight. Understanding ancient philosophy requires understanding this complexity, accepting that the ideas we value emerge from a culture we might not, that wisdom and exploitation weren't separate but tangled together in the symposium space. The deeper mystery isn't just what happened in those rooms, it's why we've worked so hard not to see it. The turning point for symposium culture came during the Peloponnesian War, the devastating conflict between Athens and Sparta that lasted from 431 to 404 BCE. This war didn't just change Athens politically and militarily, it transformed the symposium, the institution that had been central to Athenian elite culture for generations, and in transforming it, changed the course of Greek philosophy. Before the war, symposia operated in relative stability. The forms were established, the rituals understood, the social purposes clear. Young men were educated into elite culture through these gatherings. Political networks were built and maintained. Philosophy and literature flourished in this environment. The generation that included Socrates, Pericles, and the great tragic playwrights grew up in this stable symposium culture. The war disrupted everything. As Athens faced military defeats, plague, and political upheaval, symposia became sites of increasingly desperate political maneuvering. The drinking parties where men had debated abstract questions about justice and virtue became places where actual injustice and vice were plotted, where oligarchic conspiracies were hatched, where the boundaries between philosophical speculation and political action collapsed. The oligarchic coup of 411 happened at symposia. The historical sources are clear about this. The oligarchs, wealthy Athenians opposed to democracy, used symposium networks to organize their takeover. They met in private homes, drank together, swore oaths, planned the violent seizure of power. The very institution that had given Athens its philosophical culture was weaponized against Athenian democracy. Socrates was there, in those years, attending symposia, questioning everyone, making enemies. The charges that would eventually lead to his execution in 399 corrupting the youth and introducing new gods, were rooted in his symposium activities. His students included Alcibiades and Critias, both implicated in betraying Athens, both connected to him through symposium relationships. When Athens looked for someone to blame for the corruption of its youth, it looked to the symposium culture that Socrates embodied. The turning point wasn't a single moment, but a cascading series of transformations. As the war ground on, as Athens suffered defeat after defeat, symposia became darker, more desperate, more extreme. The paintings on pottery from this period show increased violence, more explicit sexuality, more images of excess and loss of control. The wine flowed stronger, the conversations became more dangerous. Plato witnessed this transformation as a young man. He was born around 427, right at the start of the war. He grew up in wartime Athens, saw the city besieged, starved, finally defeated. He saw the oligarchic coup and its aftermath. He saw his beloved teacher Socrates executed by the restored democracy. The symposium culture he knew was already collapsing, already showing cracks that would lead to its fundamental transformation. This experience shaped everything Plato wrote. His dialogues are haunted by the symposium's dual nature, its capacity for both wisdom and corruption. In the Symposium, set during the brief peace of 416, before the final disastrous Sicilian expedition, there's a poignant nostalgia, a sense of capturing a moment already passing. Socrates speaks about love and beauty and the eternal forms, while Alcibiades, drunk and crowned with ivy, bursts in to reveal the erotic complications beneath the philosophical surface. In the Republic, Plato imagines a city where symposia would be strictly controlled, where the young would be sheltered from wine and its destabilizing effects, where philosophy would happen in daylight academies under the supervision of guardians, not in lamplight drinking parties where anything could happen. This wasn't just political theory. It was Plato's response to what he'd witnessed, his attempt to rescue philosophy from the symposium context that had produced it but also corrupted it. The war ended with Athens defeated, its walls torn down, its democratic government briefly overthrown by the 30 tyrants, many of whom were connected to Socrates through symposium culture. The restoration of democracy brought a reckoning. Socrates was tried and executed, accused of crimes that were fundamentally about his role in symposium culture, about the young men he'd influenced, the questions he'd asked, the way he'd used the drinking party to undermine traditional values. After Socrates' death, symposium culture never fully recovered its central position in Athenian intellectual life. Plato founded the Academy, a new kind of institution for philosophy, one based on the older model of the gymnasium rather than the symposium. Aristotle later founded the Lyceum. These schools still included social elements, still involved friendship and conversation, but they were fundamentally different from the wine-soaked drinking parties where philosophy had been born. The transformation was gradual but irreversible. Philosophy was becoming professionalized, institutionalized, separated from the social practices that had originally produced it. The connection between wine and wisdom, between bodily pleasure and intellectual insight, between erotic desire and philosophical eros was being severed. Philosophy was moving from night to day, from private homes to public buildings, from the couch to the lecture hall. The symposium continued to exist, of course. Greeks still held drinking parties, still sang and debated and drank together. But it was no longer the centre of intellectual culture, no longer the space where the most important ideas emerged. That turning point rooted in the trauma of the Peloponnesian War and the execution of Socrates changed Western philosophy forever, shifting it from its symposium origins towards something more abstract, more formal, more divorced from the bodily and social context that had made it possible. The consequences of the symposium's transformation rippled through Athens and beyond, changing not just how philosophy was practiced, but what philosophy could be, what questions it could ask, what answers it could imagine. The shift from symposium to academy, from wine-soaked conversation to formal instruction, created both gains and losses that we're still living with today. The immediate consequence was the survival of philosophy itself. After Socrates' execution, it wasn't clear that philosophy had a future in Athens. The city had just killed its most famous philosopher, had blamed him for corrupting the youth and undermining traditional values. Many of Socrates' students fled. Some went to Megara, others scattered across the Greek world. The symposium networks that had sustained philosophical conversation were tainted by association with political conspiracies and moral corruption. Plato's solution was brilliant and consequential. He founded the Academy around 387, creating an institution that preserved the social aspects of philosophical education while distancing them from the more problematic elements of symposium culture. The Academy was located in a grove sacred to the hero Academus, outside the city walls. Students and teachers gathered there to walk and talk, to exercise and debate, to study mathematics and astronomy and dialectic. The physical setting mattered. Unlike the enclosed, private andron of a symposium, the Academy was semi-public, accessible, associated with light and air and open space rather than lamplight and wine. Philosophy happened during the day now, in gardens and gymnasia, in contexts associated with athletic training and healthy bodies, rather than with intoxication and erotic complications. The philosopher's body was being reimagined from the reclining symposiast, with wine cup in hand, to the walking teacher surrounded by students in sunlight. But something was lost in this transformation. The symposium had created a particular kind of intimacy, a space where men felt free to question everything, to challenge authority, to say things they couldn't say elsewhere. The wine mattered. It loosened tongues, broke down social hierarchies, made possible the kind of frank conversation that Greek men valued. The Academy was more respectable, more sustainable, but also more constrained by the norms of public discourse. The gendering of philosophy was another consequence. The symposium had been exclusively male, but it was a specific kind of male space, one structured around desire and intimacy, and the particular bonds between men that Greek culture cultivated. The Academy was still male-dominated, but it operated more like other public institutions, with more formal hierarchies, more distance between teacher and student. The erotic element that had been central to symposium philosophy didn't disappear, but it became more sublimated, more abstract, more uncomfortable to acknowledge. Some women did study at the Academy. Plato's receptiveness to female students was unusual for his time, but they were exceptions, and their presence changed the space in ways that made it less like a symposium and more like what we'd recognize as a school. Philosophy was becoming a profession, something you studied formally rather than something you did with friends over wine. The consequences spread geographically as Plato's students founded their own schools, and the model replicated across the Greek world. Aristotle established the Lyceum in Athens. Philosophers founded schools in Alexandria, in Rhodes, in countless cities throughout the Mediterranean. Each school had its own character, its own approach, but all represented the same fundamental shift away from symposium culture toward institutionalized education. The rise of these schools meant philosophy could survive changes in political fortune, could persist through wars and upheavals, could develop systematic bodies of knowledge that accumulated over generations. This was an enormous gain. Without the Academy and its successors, we might not have the works of Plato and Aristotle, might not have the sustained development of logic and mathematics and natural philosophy that these schools made possible. But the institutionalization also narrowed philosophy's scope. The questions that made sense to ask while reclining on a couch with friends, slightly drunk, willing to follow arguments wherever they led, were different from the questions that made sense in a formal school. Certain kinds of skepticism became less possible. Certain challenges to authority became inappropriate. Philosophy gained respectability and stability but lost some of its subversive edge. The literary consequences were profound. The dialogue form that Plato perfected, which preserved something of the symposium's conversational character, gradually gave way to treatises and commentaries. Aristotle's surviving works are lecture notes, not dialogues. Later philosophers wrote systematic works that bore little resemblance to the spontaneous back and forth of symposium conversation. Philosophy was becoming written rather than oral, monological rather than dialogical, systematic rather than exploratory. Some philosophers resisted this transformation. The Cynics rejected institutions altogether, practicing philosophy in public spaces, deliberately shocking people with their behaviour, trying to maintain something of the symposium's disruptive potential without the aristocratic pretensions. The Epicureans created garden communities that preserved some symposium elements, including friendship and pleasure, as central to the philosophical life. But these were minority positions. The mainstream development was toward increasingly formal, institutional philosophy. The consequence for wine culture was interesting. Philosophical schools still held symposia, still gathered socially, but the relationship between wine and wisdom was being rethought. Aristotle wrote extensively about friendship and its role in the good life, but he was much more cautious about wine than Plato had been. Later philosophers debated how much, if any, alcohol was appropriate for someone pursuing wisdom. The easy assumption that wine and philosophy naturally went together was breaking down. The biggest consequence was epistemological. The Symposium had operated on the assumption that truth emerged from conversation, from multiple perspectives clashing and combining, from the collective intelligence of the group enhanced by wine's loosening effects. The Academy still valued dialogue, but it was moving toward a different model where truth was discovered through individual reason, through careful argument, through systematic investigation by properly trained minds. This shift from collective to individual, from oral to written, from wine-enhanced to sober, from private to institutional, from night to day, fundamentally changed what Western philosophy would become. We gained rigorous logic and systematic metaphysics in universities and professional philosophy. We lost the assumption that wisdom emerges from friendship, from pleasure, from the kind of frank conversation that happens when social constraints relax and people feel free to say what they actually think. The fall of symposium culture was the rise of academic philosophy, and we're still living with the consequences of that transformation, still trying to figure out what we gained and what we lost when philosophy moved from the couch to the classroom. The impact of Athens' symposium culture on Western civilization is so profound and pervasive that we barely notice it anymore. The questions we ask, the way we argue, the assumption that conversation can lead to truth, the value we place on friendship and wine and good meals shared together, all of this traces back to those lamplight gatherings in ancient Athens where men reclined on couches and talked until dawn. The most obvious impact is on philosophy itself. Every Western philosophical tradition descends from those Athenian conversations. When we read Plato's dialogues in university classrooms today, we're reading stylized representations of symposium conversations. The form itself, multiple speakers debating a question from different angles, refusing to accept easy answers, pushing each other toward deeper understanding, this comes directly from symposium practice. Philosophy as we know it was born in these gatherings and still bears their mark. But the impact goes far beyond professional philosophy. The liberal arts education that forms the basis of Western higher education is fundamentally symposium culture adapted for modern institutions. The assumption that studying disparate subjects, literature and history and philosophy and science, makes you a more complete person, a better citizen. This was a symposium assumption. The Greeks didn't separate education into narrow specializations. The same men who debated philosophy also competed in poetry, discussed politics, knew music and mathematics. The symposium was where this cultural breadth was both displayed and cultivated. Our modern culture of dinner parties and salon conversations, of book clubs and discussion groups, of any gathering where people eat and drink together while talking about ideas, all of this descends from the symposium. The practice of mixing social pleasure with intellectual engagement, of making conversation itself a form of entertainment and enlightenment, comes from Athens. When you sit with friends over wine and find yourself debating some abstract question, arguing about justice or beauty or the meaning of life, you're participating in a tradition 2,500 years old. The symposium's impact on wine culture specifically is enormous. The Greek insistence that wine should be drunk in moderation, mixed with water, consumed in social context with rules and structures, this shaped how Mediterranean cultures approach alcohol. The contrast with Northern European drinking culture, which historically involved consuming beer and mead to intoxication without the elaborate social rituals, reflects the absence of symposium influence. Where Greek culture spread, wine became associated with civilization, with culture, with the kind of controlled pleasure that Greeks valued. Even our architecture bears symposium traces. The tradition of homes with special entertaining spaces, rooms designed for hosting dinners and conversations, connects to the ancient andron. The expectation in many cultures that wealthy people will have dining rooms separate from everyday eating spaces, that entertaining guests is an important social function requiring dedicated space. This reflects symposium values about the importance of hospitality and conversation. The impact on gender relations is more complicated and troubling. The symposium's exclusion of women from intellectual life, its channeling of homosocial male bonding into cultural and political power, created patterns that persisted for millennia. The assumption that serious intellectual work happens in male spaces, that women naturally belong to domestic rather than public spheres, that femininity and rationality are incompatible, all of this was reinforced by symposium culture and its descendants. Universities and learned societies for most of their history operated essentially as institutionalized symposia, exclusive male gatherings where knowledge was produced and transmitted through networks of personal relationships. The old boys' club, the smoky room where decisions get made, the informal networking that determines who gets opportunities and advancement, all of this is symposium culture persisting in modern forms. Only in recent generations have these institutions begun to open up, and the resistance to that opening often invokes symposium-derived assumptions about the natural connection between masculinity and intellectual authority. The symposium's impact on literature extends far beyond philosophy. The idea that written texts should represent conversations, that literature should capture the back and forth of human speech, that dialogue is a valid and valuable literary form, all of this comes from symposium culture. From Plato's dialogues through Galileo's scientific dialogues to modern forms like interview-based journalism and conversational podcasts, the symposium template persists. The impact on science is subtler but real. The scientific method's emphasis on community verification, on ideas being tested through public debate and criticism, on knowledge as something produced collectively rather than by isolated geniuses, reflects symposium assumptions. Scientific societies and conferences, where researchers gather to present findings and argue about interpretations, are institutionalized versions of symposium culture, adapted for empirical investigation. Our therapeutic culture, with its emphasis on talking through problems, on conversation as a path to understanding and healing, also shows symposium influence filtered through centuries of development. The assumption that speaking honestly about difficult topics, that examining your life and beliefs through dialogue, that friendship and conversation have healing power, all of this connects back to Greek ideas about the examined life and the role of frank speech in human flourishing. Even our drinking culture in educated circles often unconsciously mimics symposium patterns. The cocktail party where interesting people mix and conversations happen spontaneously. The wine tasting where appreciation of the beverage combines with social interaction. The academic conference where the real work happens at the bar after the formal sessions end. All of these are modern symposia, spaces where alcohol and conversation combine in ways we've inherited from Athens. The impact is so pervasive that it's almost invisible. We live in a culture shaped by the assumption that conversation matters, that ideas should be tested through debate, that social pleasure and intellectual work can and should combine, that friendship is central to human flourishing, that the examined life is worth living. These assumptions feel natural, universal, obvious. They're not. They're specific cultural products born in ancient Athens, refined through centuries of transmission, now so thoroughly embedded in Western culture that we mistake them for human nature itself. The symposium gave us a model for how humans can live together, learn together, think together. It gave us practices and institutions and assumptions that still structure how we pursue knowledge and build communities. 25 centuries later, its impact is everywhere, shaping our world in ways we barely recognize because they're so fundamental to how we understand what it means to be human, to be civilized, to seek wisdom together. Behind the grand narrative of philosophy and cultural transformation, behind the debates about wine and wisdom and institutional change, were individual human beings living specific lives, experiencing the symposium in personal, unrepeatable ways. Most of them left no record. Their names are lost, their stories untold, their voices silent across the centuries. But occasionally, in fragments and casual mentions, we catch glimpses of these forgotten people and remember that symposium culture wasn't just an abstract institution, but a lived reality for thousands of individuals. Consider the serving boy, perhaps 14 years old, standing in the corner of a well-appointed andron on a warm Athenian evening in 420 BCE. He's been enslaved since childhood, purchased by a wealthy household to serve at symposia and other social gatherings. He knows the rituals perfectly, when to refill cups, how to mix wine at different ratios, where to stand so he's available but not intrusive. He listens to the conversations, sometimes understanding them, sometimes not, filing away information that might prove useful later. The boy is beautiful in the way that Greek culture valued, slim and smooth-skinned with delicate features. He knows the older men watch him, that some of their jokes and comments are about him, that his master sometimes offers his services to favoured guests. This is normal, expected, part of what enslaved boys do in wealthy households. He learned early not to show what he thinks or feels, to be present but invisible, to serve without seeming to exist as a person with his own inner life. What did he think while pouring wine for Socrates, listening to the old philosopher question some general about courage, watching wealthy men get drunk and argue and grope each other? Did the ideas interest him? Did he wonder about the questions they debated so passionately? Or was he thinking about survival, about his own uncertain future, about the impossibility of freedom in a world where enslavement was taken for granted by everyone around him, even by philosophers who questioned everything else? We don't know. His voice is lost. We know boys like him existed because the sources mention them constantly, but always as objects, never as subjects with their own perspectives worth recording. He served the wine that loosened tongues and enabled the conversations that birthed Western philosophy, but he left no mark on that philosophy, no trace in the historical record beyond the generic category of serving boy, interchangeable and forgettable. Or consider the flute girl, a young woman named Daphne perhaps, hired for the evening to provide musical entertainment at a symposium in the house of a wealthy trader. She's a freed woman, once enslaved but purchased her freedom through years of work and saving. She knows dozens of traditional songs, can improvise new ones, plays the aulos with skill that makes her expensive to hire for important gatherings. She arrives as the men finish their meal, carrying her instrument wrapped in cloth. The symposiarch acknowledges her, explains what kind of evening this is supposed to be, more philosophical than usual, which might mean she'll play less or might mean she'll play more, depending on whether the conversation actually stays serious or degenerates into the usual drinking and sexual banter. She takes her position, begins playing, watching the room's dynamics, adjusting her music to the mood. Daphne has played at hundreds of symposia. She's seen everything, the affairs and betrayals, the political conspiracies, the philosophical debates and drunken arguments. She's been propositioned, groped, propositioned again, more insistently. She's learned which households to avoid, which symposiarchs will protect musicians from overly aggressive guests, which gatherings will pay well, and which will try to cheat her. What did she think of Greek philosophy, of the grand ideas about justice and virtue debated by men who thought nothing of using women as entertainment and sexual objects? Did she find their discussions hypocritical, their self-importance amusing? Or did she simply not care, focused on earning money, on surviving in a society that offered limited options for women outside marriage or continued enslavement? Her perspective would be invaluable, but no one thought to record it. She appears in the sources only as the flute girl, generic and voiceless, part of the symposium furniture rather than a full human being. Think about the young student, a citizen boy from a moderately wealthy family, attending his first real symposium at age 16. He's nervous, unsure how to recline properly on the couch, uncomfortable with the physical proximity to older men, overwhelmed by the expectation that he'll participate in conversation with his elders. He sips the wine too quickly, feels his head start to swim, tries to focus on what's being said. An older man, a friend of his father's, sits beside him, places a hand on his knee while asking about his education. The boy knows this is how relationships form, how he'll be integrated into elite culture, but he's frightened and excited and confused all at once. The wine helps a little, loosening his tongue, making everything seem less serious. By midnight he's participating in the conversation, arguing some point about Homer, feeling for the first time like maybe he belongs in this world. Years later, perhaps, he'll think back on this night as the beginning of his intellectual life, the moment he discovered he could hold his own in debate with older, more educated men. Or perhaps he'll remember it with shame or anger as the night certain boundaries were crossed, certain pressures applied that he didn't know how to resist. We'll never know because this particular boy, like most symposium participants, left no record, exist only as one of thousands who pass through this institution, shaped by it in ways that determine the course of their lives. What about the wife at home, excluded from the symposium but where it's happening, knowing her husband is reclining with other men, drinking and talking about important things she's not allowed to discuss? Does she resent the exclusion? accept it as natural, feel relief that she's not required to participate in these wine-soaked gatherings that often last until dawn. The sources rarely tell us what women thought about symposium culture because no one thought their opinions mattered enough to record. These forgotten voices, enslaved and free, male and female, young and old, represent the vast majority of people involved in symposium culture. For every Socrates or Plato whose voice comes down to us through texts and histories, there were hundreds whose experiences are lost, whose perspectives remain unknown, whose humanity was invisible to those who controlled the written record. The symposium wasn't just an intellectual institution. It was a lived reality for all these people, shaping their lives in ways both profound and mundane, leaving marks on their bodies and minds and relationships even though it left no mark in history. Not everyone in Athens embraced symposium culture. From the beginning, voices rose in opposition, questioning whether these wine-soaked gatherings were compatible with civic virtue, whether the exclusivity and excess they represented corrupted rather than elevated Greek society. This opposition came from multiple directions and for different reasons, creating a persistent tension in Athenian culture between the symposium ideal and its critics. The democratic faction had practical reasons for suspicion. Symposia were inherently aristocratic institutions. They happened in private homes, required leisure time and disposable income, created networks of personal loyalty that cut across and sometimes against civic institutions. The oligarchic conspiracies that repeatedly threatened Athenian democracy were hatched at symposia. The 30 tyrants who briefly overthrew the democracy after the Peloponnesian War were connected through symposium relationships. For Democrats who believed in public accountability and equal participation, the symposium represented everything dangerous about aristocratic power. Some speakers in the assembly argued for restrictions on symposia. They proposed laws limiting the size of private gatherings, requiring supervision of drinking parties, penalizing hosts whose symposia led to public disorder. These proposals rarely passed because the men who dominated Athenian politics were themselves symposium participants. But the very fact that such laws were proposed reveals the tension. Democracy and symposium culture coexisted uneasily, each representing different visions of how society should function. Religious conservatives objected on different grounds. They worried that symposium culture encouraged impiety, that drunken men were more likely to mock the gods, that the sexual activities at symposia violated sacred boundaries. Some prosecutors used this angle when bringing charges against individuals. Socrates was accused of introducing new gods and corrupting youth, charges that made sense only in the context of his symposium activities, his questioning of traditional beliefs, his influence over young men who met him at drinking parties. Moralists across the political spectrum criticized symposium excess. They pointed to the health effects of heavy drinking, the violence that erupted at drunken gatherings, the marriages destroyed by affairs that began at symposia, the young men led astray by older lovers who met them at drinking parties. Medical writers warned about the physical dangers. Philosophers debated whether pleasure and wisdom were compatible, whether the supposedly moderate drinking that symposia promoted was actually an excuse for indulgence. Some of the most effective critics were women, though their voices come down to us filtered through male authors. In Aristophanes' Lysistrata, the women of Greece go on a sex strike to end the war, explicitly criticizing the male symposium culture that they blame for the conflict. The play is comedy, but the critique resonates. Women point out that they bear the cost of male behavior, raise children who will die in wars started at symposia, manage households, while husbands waste time and money at drinking parties. Freed slaves and those born from enslaved mothers sometimes spoke critically about symposium culture from their own perspectives. They'd seen it from the inside as servants or entertainers, knew the gap between the high-minded philosophical discussions and the actual behavior, the use of enslaved bodies for pleasure, the casual cruelty that wine made more rather than less likely. Their testimony rarely appears in formal literature but surfaces in law court speeches and casual references. The philosophers themselves were divided. Socrates participated in symposia but also criticized them, using the gathering as a platform to question whether the values it represented were actually worth pursuing. His most famous student, Plato, had a deeply ambivalent relationship with symposium culture. He wrote dialogues celebrating it while also proposing in the Republic that his ideal city would strictly control wine consumption and sexual relationships, effectively abolishing traditional symposium culture. Later philosophical schools took harder stances. The Cynics rejected symposium culture entirely, along with most other social conventions. Diogenes allegedly masturbated in public, arguing that if satisfying hunger in public was acceptable, why not satisfying sexual desire? The provocation was aimed directly at symposium culture, which surrounded sexuality and pleasure with elaborate rituals and rules. Cynics suggested these rituals were hypocrisy, that honest satisfaction of bodily needs was more virtuous than the pretense of refinement. The Stoics advocated emotional control that was fundamentally incompatible with symposium excess. They didn't absolutely forbid wine or social gatherings, but they insisted that the wise man remained unmoved by pleasure, that getting drunk and losing control was shameful regardless of the social context. Stoic critique of symposium culture appealed to those who found the traditional aristocratic values troubling, but wanted philosophical justification for their discomfort. Foreign critics saw symposium culture as distinctively and problematically Greek. Persians drank wine unmixed and got drunk deliberately, without the elaborate rituals. They found Greek insistence on mixing wine and controlling consumption effeminate, unnecessary restraint that real men didn't need. Romans initially viewed Greek symposium culture with suspicion, seeing it as Eastern decadence that threatened Roman martial values. Only gradually did they adopt and adapt symposium practices, creating their own versions that emphasized different values. Some opposition came from those excluded from symposium culture. Poorer citizens who couldn't afford to host or regularly attend drinking parties, foreigners who weren't fully integrated into elite social networks, men whose age or status made them unwelcome at certain gatherings. Their opposition mixed resentment with critique, questioning why society was organized around an institution that privileged some and excluded others. The opposition never destroyed symposium culture, but it created persistent pressure, forced defenders to justify these gatherings, generated the philosophical debates about pleasure and virtue, and the good life that were themselves often conducted at symposia. The tension between symposium culture and its critics was productive, pushing Greeks to articulate and defend their values, to think carefully about the relationship between private pleasure and public virtue, between individual freedom and civic responsibility. This opposition matters because it reveals that symposium culture was contested, not universally accepted, that even in its heyday there were Athenians who questioned whether these gatherings represented the best of Greek civilization or its most troubling aspects. The philosophy that emerged from symposia emerged partly in response to this criticism, as an attempt to prove that wine and wisdom, pleasure and virtue, aristocratic privilege and genuine insight could coexist despite the obvious tensions. In the generations following Plato and Aristotle, Greek philosophy underwent a remarkable transformation, a cultural renaissance that both built on symposium traditions and transcended them. This awakening happened as Greek culture spread throughout the Mediterranean following Alexander the Great's conquests, as new cities were founded and old ideas encountered new contexts, as philosophy evolved from an exclusively Athenian phenomenon into a truly international movement. The catalyst was geographical expansion. When Alexander conquered the Persian Empire between 334 and 323 BCE, Greek culture suddenly had access to vast new territories, new peoples, new ideas. Greek settlers founded cities throughout the Near East and Egypt. They built theatres and gymnasia and temples, but they also encountered philosophical traditions very different from their own. Indian philosophy, Persian religious thought, Egyptian wisdom traditions, all suddenly became available to Greek thinkers willing to look beyond their inherited assumptions. The Museum and Library of Alexandria, founded around 300 BCE, became the new centre of Greek intellectual life. This institution was different from Plato's Academy or Aristotle's Lyceum. It was an international research institution, funded by the Ptolemaic dynasty, staffed by scholars from throughout the Greek world and beyond. The library collected texts in multiple languages, attempted to gather all human knowledge in one place. The museum, literally a temple to the muses, provided housing and support for scholars pursuing all kinds of investigation. This wasn't symposium culture anymore, though social drinking and conversation remained important to how scholars interacted. It was something larger, more systematic, more ambitious. The assumption that a small group of friends reclining on couches could figure out the truth about everything through conversation was giving way to the recognition that knowledge required vast collections of texts, specialized expertise, systematic investigation across many domains. Philosophy was becoming one discipline among many, not the master discourse that encompassed everything. New philosophical schools emerged that reflected this changed environment. The Stoics, founded by Zeno of Citium around 300 BCE, developed a cosmopolitan philosophy that emphasized universal human rationality over Greek cultural particularity. Anyone could be a philosopher regardless of birth or wealth or education, because reason was a universal human capacity. This was a radical departure from symposium culture, which had been explicitly aristocratic, exclusive, tied to Greek male identity. The Epicureans, founded by Epicurus around the same time, created garden communities that preserved some symposium elements while democratizing access. Women were welcome in Epicurean communities, a shocking innovation that generated criticism. Enslaved people could study Epicurean philosophy. The emphasis was on friendship and pleasure, values central to symposium culture, but liberated from the aristocratic and pederastic context that had made traditional symposia so problematic. The skeptics took symposium questioning to its logical extreme, doubting whether certain knowledge was possible about anything, suspending judgment on all metaphysical claims. This radical doubt emerged from symposium culture's emphasis on challenging assumptions and questioning authority, but it also represented a kind of philosophical exhaustion, a recognition that the confident claims of earlier philosophers couldn't be sustained. The awakening involved recognizing limits as much as expanding possibilities. The generation after Aristotle realized that philosophy alone couldn't answer every question, that empirical investigation was necessary for understanding nature, that mathematics was essential for astronomy and physics, that medicine required clinical observation and anatomical study. The dream of a single, unified knowledge emerging from philosophical conversation was fragmenting into multiple specialized disciplines. This specialization was both loss and gain. Philosophers no longer claimed to understand everything, but what they did study they investigated with new rigor and sophistication. Logic became increasingly formal and technical. Ethical philosophy developed detailed accounts of how to live well in imperfect circumstances. Political philosophy grappled with the reality of vast multicultural empires rather than small city-states. The questions asked at symposia were being refined, systematized, developed into traditions of inquiry that could accumulate knowledge across generations. The cultural renaissance also involved recovering and systematizing earlier thought. The Great Library at Alexandria collected philosophical texts, producing standard editions, writing commentaries, creating the apparatus of scholarship that would allow later generations to study Greek philosophy. What had been oral tradition and scattered writings became a textual tradition that could be taught systematically to students who had never attended a symposium, who lived far from Athens, who spoke Greek as a second language. Women's voices became slightly more audible during this period, though still marginalized. Female philosophers appeared in several schools. Hipparchia became a famous Cynic philosopher, shocking Athens by appearing in public with her philosopher husband and arguing philosophy with men. Several women studied with Epicurus and contributed to Epicurean philosophy. These were exceptions, tiny cracks in the wall of male dominance, but they revealed possibilities that symposium culture had systematically suppressed. The awakening also involved new literary forms for expressing philosophy. The dialogue form that Plato perfected gradually gave way to treatises, commentaries, handbooks. Philosophy was becoming technical literature meant for study rather than conversational performance. This change reflected the institutionalization of philosophy, its transformation from an aristocratic leisure activity into a professional discipline pursued by dedicated scholars. Something was gained in this transformation. Philosophy became more rigorous, more systematic, more capable of accumulating knowledge across generations. Insights from different schools could be compared and evaluated. Arguments could be examined carefully rather than disappearing into the ephemeral flow of conversation. The cultural renaissance produced achievements that symposium culture alone could never have generated. But something was also lost. The immediacy of philosophical conversation, the sense that wisdom emerged from living relationships between real people, the connection between philosophy and pleasure and friendship, and the embodied experience of thinking together while sharing food and wine, All of this faded as philosophy became increasingly professional and academic. The price of philosophy's awakening into a mature discipline was the loss of its youthful spontaneity, its roots in the messy human reality of people trying to figure out how to live while enjoying each other's company. The Renaissance wasn't a clean break with symposium culture. Elements persisted, adapted to new contexts, but the fundamental transformation was irreversible. Philosophy had awakened into a new form, more powerful in some ways, more limited in others, forever marked by its origins in Athenian drinking parties but no longer bound by those origins, free to develop in directions that Socrates and his companions, reclining on their couches in lamplight, could never have imagined. The deepest truth about symposium culture and its role in birthing Western philosophy is one that makes us uncomfortable, that challenges fundamental assumptions about how knowledge is produced and what philosophy is. This truth emerges only when we stop trying to separate the wine from the wisdom, the bodies from the ideas, the problematic social practices from the brilliant insights, and instead accept that they were inseparable, that Greek philosophy was what it was precisely because of, not despite, the troubling context from which it emerged. The revelation is this: the greatest intellectual achievement of Western civilization was born from an institution built on exclusion, exploitation, and intoxication. There's no way to separate these elements. You can't extract the pure philosophical insights and discard the wine-soaked aristocratic male homoeroticism and the enslavement and the exclusion of women and the power imbalances. They're not separable because the social context wasn't just background to the philosophy, it was constitutive of it. Socrates questioned everything, but he never questioned whether symposia should be restricted to male citizens. Plato imagined ideal cities, but he couldn't imagine philosophy happening without the homosocial intimacy that symposium culture provided. Aristotle analysed friendship with unprecedented sophistication, but the friendships he analysed were exclusively between free male citizens. The limitations weren't peripheral to Greek philosophy. They shaped what questions could be asked, what answers seemed reasonable, what counted as wisdom. This doesn't mean we should reject Greek philosophy. That would be both impossible and foolish. Greek philosophical achievements are real. The methods of logical argument, the practice of questioning assumptions, the commitment to following reasoning wherever it leads, the recognition that examined life is better than unexamined existence. All of these are genuine contributions that have enriched human civilization. But accepting the achievements requires accepting their troubling origins, holding both truths simultaneously without letting either cancel the other out. The revelation forces recognition that knowledge is always situated, always emerging from specific historical and social contexts that shape what can be thought and said. The Enlightenment dream of pure reason transcending all cultural particularity, of philosophy as the voice of universal humanity speaking eternal truths. This dream was always false. Philosophy is humans thinking, and humans are always embedded in particular bodies, particular social positions, particular historical moments. Greek philosophy was Greek, symposium philosophy was symposium-shaped, and those particulars matter. Understanding this changes how we read Plato. The symposium isn't just a philosophical dialogue about love, it's a detailed representation of an actual social practice, preserving both the brilliance and the troubling aspects of that practice. When Alcibiades describes trying to seduce Socrates, when he talks about crawling under Socrates' cloak and spending the night with him, this isn't metaphorical. It's describing real behaviours, real relationships, real forms of power and desire that were normal in symposium culture, even though we find them problematic now. The revelation also illuminates why certain questions dominated Greek philosophy, while others were barely asked. Why did Greeks obsess over justice and courage and wisdom, but rarely discussed compassion or care? Because symposium culture valued competitive debate and martial virtue and public achievement, not the domestic virtues associated with women and family life. Why did Greek ethics focus so heavily on the individual achieving excellence rather than on relationships and community? Because the symposium privileged individual performance, each man taking his turn speaking, competing for status and recognition. Some modern philosophers have tried to argue that Greek philosophy transcended its origins, that once Plato articulated the theory of forms or Aristotle developed formal logic, these achievements became universal, independent of the context that produced them. But this misses the point. Even abstract logical arguments bear traces of their social origins. The adversarial style of Western philosophy, the assumption that truth emerges from debate and criticism, the privileging of certain kinds of questions and certain ways of arguing, all of this reflects symposium culture. The revelation is uncomfortable because it suggests our inheritance is more compromised than we'd like to believe. Western civilization claims Greek philosophy as foundational, presents it as the source of our commitment to reason and democracy and human dignity. But the actual historical reality is messier. Greek philosophy emerged from practices we now condemn. Democracy coexisted with slavery. Reason served aristocratic interests. Human dignity was restricted to free male citizens. This doesn't mean we're stuck with Greek limitations. One of philosophy's great virtues is its capacity for self-criticism, for turning its methods on itself, for recognizing and potentially correcting its own blindnesses. The tools Greek philosophy gave us, the practice of questioning assumptions and following arguments wherever they lead, these tools can be used to critique Greek philosophy itself, to recognize its limitations and work beyond them. Modern philosophy has gradually expanded its scope, included voices that symposium culture excluded, asked questions that Greeks never thought to ask. Feminist philosophy, critical race theory, disability studies, post-colonial thought, all of these use philosophical methods to challenge philosophical traditions, revealing assumptions and exclusions that earlier generations couldn't or wouldn't see. This is philosophy growing beyond its origins, becoming more inclusive, more self-aware, more capable of recognizing its own situatedness. But we can't fully transcend origins. We can work with and against our inheritance, but we can't simply discard it and start fresh. Greek philosophy is woven too deeply into Western intellectual tradition, shapes too much of how we think and argue and imagine alternatives. The revelation is that we need to know this history, understand these origins, recognize both the achievements and the compromises. The deepest truth is that wisdom has always been entangled with power, that insight emerges from specific social practices that include and exclude, that the life of the mind is never separate from the life of the body and the social arrangements that govern bodies. Greek philosophy taught us to question everything. Perhaps the most important question it enables us to ask is about philosophy itself, about how knowledge is produced, whose perspectives count, what assumptions remain unexamined. The Symposium gave us philosophy, but it gave us philosophy marked by its origins in wine and exclusion and problematic intimacies. We inherit both the brilliance and the blindness, both the methods and the limitations. The revelation is that this is how knowledge always works, how human achievements always emerge from human practices, how we're always simultaneously enlightened and constrained by the contexts that make our thinking possible. Understanding this doesn't solve anything, but it might make us wiser about the limits of wisdom itself. In the deepening silence of this late hour, with lamplight flickering low and the weight of history settling around us like comfortable darkness, we might pause to consider what these ancient drinking parties mean for our own lives, our own search for wisdom, our own attempts to create spaces where genuine conversation and transformation become possible. The distance of 25 centuries creates clarity, allows us to see patterns in Athenian symposia that might illuminate our own practices and their limitations. We live in an era that simultaneously idealizes and struggles with conversation. We claim to value dialogue, to believe that talking through differences can produce understanding and maybe even truth. We create countless platforms for discussion, from academic conferences to online forums to podcast conversations. Yet genuine dialogue seems increasingly rare, drowned out by performance and posturing, by the need to win arguments rather than explore ideas, by the absence of the very things that made symposia work, trust and friendship, and the willingness to be changed by conversation. The Symposium suggests that meaningful conversation requires specific conditions. It needs intimacy, a small enough group that everyone can participate. It needs time, hours stretching into night without pressure to conclude or produce outcomes. It needs some shared foundation, common reference points and values that allow disagreement to be productive rather than merely divisive. It needs rules, not to constrain, but to create space where everyone can speak and be heard. And it needs something to loosen tongues, whether wine or simply the safety to say what you really think without fear of consequences. Modern institutions rarely provide these conditions. Universities claim to foster dialogue, but organise education around lectures and papers, individual performance and credential accumulation. Conferences bring people together but schedule them too tightly. Create competitive environments where presentations become performances rather than explorations. Online platforms enable global conversation but sacrifice intimacy and trust, turning every discussion into a public performance where nuance dies beneath the weight of audience expectations. Some people try to recreate symposium conditions in book clubs and dinner parties, and informal gatherings where friends talk seriously about ideas that matter. These modern symposia face their own challenges. Without the supporting culture that made Athenian symposia work, without the shared education and values and willingness to spend entire nights in conversation, contemporary attempts often fall flat. We're too busy, too distracted, too aware of time passing and obligations waiting. We've lost the art of sustained conversation, the ability to follow an argument through hours of exploration without needing to arrive at conclusions. The symposium also reminds us that exclusion has intellectual costs. When you restrict conversation to people who look like you, think like you, share your social position, you limit what can be questioned and imagined. The symposium's male-only character wasn't just ethically problematic, it was intellectually limiting, preventing Greeks from asking certain questions, seeing certain truths, developing certain insights that required different perspectives and experiences. Our contemporary struggles with inclusion reflect this lesson imperfectly learned. We've expanded who can participate in intellectual life, opened universities and institutions to women and people of colour, and those from working-class backgrounds. This is genuine progress, genuine expansion of who gets to contribute to knowledge production. Yet resistance persists, often unconscious, built into practices and assumptions inherited from exclusionary traditions. The symposium's long shadow extends into modern academic culture, shaping who feels welcome, whose ideas get taken seriously, what counts as legitimate philosophy. The relationship between pleasure and wisdom that symposium culture embodied raises questions we still haven't resolved. Is intellectual work supposed to be pleasurable? Should learning feel good? Contemporary education often assumes the opposite, that serious thinking requires discipline and denial, that pleasure is distraction from the real work of knowledge. But symposium culture insisted that wine and friendship and bodily comfort weren't obstacles to wisdom, but pathways toward it, that loosening up rather than tightening control could open possibilities for insight. Maybe this is one reason why some of our most productive thinking happens not in formal settings, but in informal ones, not during scheduled work time, but during breaks and meals and social gatherings. The coffee shop conversation that suddenly illuminates a problem you've been struggling with, the insight that comes while walking with a friend, the breakthrough achieved not through discipline but through relaxation, letting the conscious mind soften and the unconscious do its work. The symposium understood something about embodied cognition that contemporary intellectual culture often forgets. Yet we can't simply return to symposium culture. We know too much about the costs, about what exclusion does to both excluded and excluders, about how power shapes whose pleasures count and whose don't. We can't unknow the ways that symposium culture's intimacies were compromised by coercion and exploitation, by the presence of enslaved servants and vulnerable young men, by the assumption that some bodies exist for others' use. What we might do is carry forward what was valuable in symposium culture, while refusing its exclusions and exploitations. We might create spaces for genuine conversation that are more rather than less inclusive. We might recognize that wisdom requires both discipline and pleasure, both structure and spontaneity. We might value friendship and conversation, and the slow development of ideas through dialogue while ensuring that everyone can participate, that vulnerability doesn't become exploitation, that pleasure doesn't require domination. The reflection that the symposium enables is ultimately about how we want to live together, how we want to pursue wisdom, what we're willing to give up and what we refuse to sacrifice. The Athenians created something remarkable in their drinking parties, a social technology for producing certain kinds of insight and connection. They also built that technology on foundations we now recognize as unjust. We can't simply embrace or reject the legacy. We have to sort through it carefully, taking what's valuable, refusing what's harmful, always aware that our own practices will someday be judged by standards we can't yet imagine. In this moment of reflection, in the quiet space created by thinking about vanished worlds, and the people who inhabited them, perhaps we can ask ourselves what spaces we're creating for genuine conversation, whose voices we're centering and whose we're excluding. Whether our pursuit of wisdom includes pleasure and friendship or treats them as obstacles, whether we're building on symposium foundations or finally moving beyond them into something new. These questions have no easy answers, but asking them might be the most symposium-like thing we can do, the most faithful way to honour what was best in that tradition, while refusing to repeat its worst failures. The physical traces of symposium culture are scattered across museums and archaeological sites, fragments of a world that once seemed permanent, but now exists only in memory and imagination. In Athens, you can still see the foundations of ancient houses with their andrones, special rooms designed for reclining and drinking and conversation. The spaces are empty now, the couches gone, the painted walls faded or destroyed, but the proportions remain, the careful geometry that determined how many men could gather, how they would face each other, how conversation would circulate through the space. The pottery survives in remarkable abundance. Walk through any major museum with a Greek collection, and you'll see hundreds of symposium vessels, kylikes and craters and oinochoi, each one decorated with scenes from the drinking party. The images are frozen moments, painted figures forever caught in the act of pouring wine or playing music or arguing or embracing. They speak across 25 centuries with surprising clarity, preserving gestures and expressions that still communicate something essential about what it meant to be human in ancient Athens. Some of the most moving pieces are fragmentary, broken long ago and now reassembled with visible gaps where the painted surface is lost. These fragments feel more honest somehow than the intact vessels, acknowledging the incompleteness of our knowledge, the way the past always comes to us in pieces that we must imagine back into wholeness. The missing sections force you to reconstruct, to use imagination informed by evidence, to recognize that any picture we draw of the past is necessarily partial and provisional. The literary legacy is more complex. We have the dialogues of Plato and Xenophon, stylized representations of symposia that preserve something of the conversational spirit even as they idealize and reshape it for philosophical purposes. We have fragments of drinking songs, scraps of comedy, references scattered through legal speeches and historical works. We have enough to know that symposia were central to Athenian culture, not enough to fully reconstruct the experience of attending one, of being there in lamplight with wine and friends and ideas circulating through the warm darkness. The philosophical legacy extends far beyond these texts. Every time we use dialogue as a form for exploring ideas, every time we assume that conversation can lead to truth, every time we value questioning over accepting, argument over authority, we're drawing on traditions that symposium culture crystallized and transmitted. The methods of philosophy are inseparable from the social practices that produced them. Socratic questioning, Platonic dialectic, Aristotelian systematic investigation, all bear traces of their symposium origins even when practiced in very different contexts. The architectural legacy persists in how we design spaces for gathering and conversation. The dining rooms of wealthy homes, the seminar rooms of universities, the coffee shops where people meet to talk, all reflect symposium assumptions about the relationship between space and interaction. We still believe that the right physical environment can facilitate certain kinds of connection and insight, that gathering around tables or in comfortable seating arrangements makes conversation flow more easily than standing formally in rows. The social legacy is harder to trace, but perhaps most pervasive. The assumption that friendship matters intellectually, that learning happens best in communities, that conversation with interesting people is valuable in itself, regardless of practical outcomes. All of these ideas have symposium roots. So does the darker legacy of exclusion, of intellectual spaces organized around male bonding, of knowledge production separated from domestic life and women's work, of the assumption that serious thinking requires retreating from family and household into homosocial gatherings. We're still working through this legacy, still trying to figure out what to keep and what to discard, what to transform and what to transcend. Universities still struggle with creating genuine intellectual community in institutions organized around individual achievement. Philosophy departments still grapple with the field's masculine culture, the adversarial style that values destroying arguments over building understanding. We still search for the right balance between structure and spontaneity, between discipline and pleasure, between individual insight and collective wisdom. The Symposium endures in memory as a possibility, a model for how humans might gather to think together. Not a model to replicate exactly, given all we now know about its exclusions and problems, but a reminder that philosophy was once embedded in social practice, that wisdom once emerged from friendship and conversation, and shared pleasure, rather than from isolated individual contemplation. Whether that embedding was ultimately good or bad remains debatable, but that it was real is undeniable. In museums behind glass, the painted kylikes wait patiently for viewers who will never drink from them, will never experience the specific delight of tilting the cup and discovering the image inside, the face of a symposiast, or a god, or some mythological scene that suddenly appears as the wine drains away. These objects were made for use, for the specific social ritual of the drinking party, and now they exist only as artifacts, beautiful and informative but severed from their original purpose. Perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps every cultural achievement eventually becomes an artifact, something we study and admire but can no longer fully inhabit. The Symposium gave us philosophy, gave us practices and ideas that shaped Western civilization, but the actual social reality of those gatherings is irretrievably lost. We can learn from it, can think carefully about what it reveals about the relationship between knowledge and power, between pleasure and wisdom, between inclusion and insight. But we can't go back. We can only go forward, carrying the legacy imperfectly, trying to preserve what was valuable while refusing to perpetuate what was harmful. As this long night draws toward dawn, as the lamp oil burns low, and the conversation finally winds down towards silence, we might imagine ourselves back in an Athenian andron, reclining on couches with the last of the wine. Voices growing quiet as exhaustion and satiation finally overcome the impulse to keep talking. In that silence, in that moment between night and morning, between intoxication and sobriety, between the closed world of the Symposium and the daylight world of politics and commerce and ordinary life, something lingers. Not answers, not solutions, not even necessarily wisdom. Just the sense that something happened here, something that mattered, something worth remembering even if we can't quite articulate what it was or what it means. The stones remain, the pottery remains, the words remain, filtered through centuries of transmission and translation and interpretation. The legacy remains, complicated and contested, simultaneously inspiring and troubling. What we make of it, how we carry it forward, what we choose to preserve and what we choose to transform, these are questions for us to answer. Questions that might best be explored not in isolation but together, in conversation, maybe even over wine, in spaces we create for thinking and talking and discovering what wisdom might mean for our own time, in our own contexts, with all the people who are excluded from ancient symposia but who have wisdom to contribute if only we're willing to listen. The legacy lives in how we choose to gather, how we choose to think, how we choose to be together in pursuit of understanding. That choice remains ours to make, now and in every moment that follows, until we too become artifacts. Stories told by those who come after, fragments preserved in whatever memory and stone survive.